All right, thank you everyone who has logged on at the moment. I think rather than wait for any further attendees, I will commence. Welcome today. We're in the middle of some really major changes to the New Zealand environment. We all, I suppose, expected that they were coming, but now they're here and we have to deal with them. So I hope that the presentation that we go through today will give you some real practical tools about managing the workplace environment in the midst of all of these changes. What we're going to do is go through the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions on the chat function, and I won't be answering those questions during the presentation unless I can see that one is particularly appropriate to where I'm at in the presentation. Otherwise, at the end of it, we'll open it up to a Q&A and I'll go through the questions that are presented and answer as many of them as I can and try and bring clarity to situations that affect as many of you as possible. Okay. So the basic facts of where we are at the moment. We all know these things, but just to cover them off so that we're all clear. Auckland is at alert level 3 until midnight on Wednesday, the 26th of August. That is basically a week's time. Travel is restricted into and out of Auckland. Essential businesses can only operate from their workplaces. Public venues are closed, and social distancing, contact tracing, and hygiene measures are incredibly important. I think to clarify that, we are seeing as well in recent developments a couple of cases that are not linked to the major cluster that exists, and that is opening up the possibility that alert level 3 is not necessarily going to reduce to level 2 or level 1 very quickly. It all depends on what is discovered, but the reality is if there's community transmission that they are unable to control or trace, there may well be some caution, and I think we all respect that that caution is very well advised given what we see in Australia and other places around the world. But it will mean that possibly alert levels continue beyond Wednesday, the 26th of August. The rest of New Zealand is at alert level 2, and provided the same situation exists, we are looking to reduce, but also if community transmission leaves the Auckland area and is found elsewhere in New Zealand, if it's Christchurch or Rotorua or Wellington, obviously that will change how the government wants to look at this, and we'll have to then see what happens at that stage. So as I say, the future is not very clear. We can make some estimations, but we are in a process of change. We are in a difficult environment where we cannot predict the future. And for that reason, we need to be thinking how we are able to plan for today, but keeping in mind what we might have to do tomorrow. Okay, so the reality is that it might improve. The reality is that it might get worse, and we need to be ready for all of those things. And you'll see in what I say in the presentation that we need to plan for all three at the same time and communicate clearly to employees around a number of different possible scenarios at the same time, so that they are aware of the risks that a business is facing and the possible outcomes that might exist. The reality is that they will be governed, most employees will be relying on rumors, social media, and news headlines. The government's been very clear that only what's officially broadcast via the updates and the COVID-19 website are to be relied on. And I think we can all agree that that's probably very wise. So please, in terms of talking to your employees, don't reinforce social media theories. For example, last week there were rumors running around that we were going to go to level 4 in Auckland, for example, and that obviously was not true. But it could have created a lot of anxiety and a lot of even bad decision making if people were rushing to base their decisions off of very unsubstantiated theories. So my main encouragement is to work off facts and to encourage your employees to also work off facts. And where you're responsible for providing those facts, it's good to do that as thoroughly as possible. Okay, so to quote an old mentor, Bob Dylan, in 1964, he wrote the song "Times They Are A-Changing," and I guess that is still true every single day today. So what we need to do as employers is plan for change. We know it's coming. We know it's going to happen. So we need to factor that into our world. In a normal environment, we can carry on day to day without thinking, are things going to change? How could they be different in a week or two? That is not the season we're in. We're in a season where we need to plan for things to be different next week than they are this week, and to think ahead of time, how are we going to talk about that and how are we going to change what we do to adapt to be ready for that. So in planning for change, I think the one thing I want us all to focus on is communication. We're dealing with employees who are unsettled, very concerned. This is entirely normal and we've all been there before. But the entire world is in the grip of something that is very obviously not under great control. And so even when we provide a little bit of certainty, people are still looking around and going, this whole place is in a struggle. How do we trust what we're hearing? And the way they trust what they're hearing is by hearing a lot of information clearly communicated and very well set out for them. So a powerful settling factor amongst your employees is going to be the degree to which they can see that you are approaching this strategically and with forethought. The more they can see your plans, the more they have visibility over what's going on and how you're handling it, the more settled they will be and the more they will trust what you're doing and the approach that you're taking. So there are basically three stages to the world we find ourselves in right now. There's what we know, which is the fact that we're in level 3 in Auckland and level 2 elsewhere in the country. And we also know a little bit about the clusters, a bit about the infection rates, a little bit about what's not known in terms of where the clusters have originated and the cases that can't be linked to the cluster. We know all of that. And that leads us to be able to confidently guess certain things about the future. One of those is that if they can control those unknown cases, we will probably be in a position where the government, having cracked down heavily, is going to be able to take us back down to a better alert level. But also we know that if there's a sudden explosion of cases and we don't know where they come from, we can also confidently guess that we'll go to a higher alert level. So we know those two paths. There's a fork in the road and we know what could cause us to go down each of those paths. So we can plan to some extent for that. The stuff we don't know is what's going to happen in a few weeks or a month's time. We have no idea how successful our control measures are going to be at the end of the day. We only know the medium term. So we don't need to plan for what we don't know. We can't plan for it. But the ability to plan for what we do know and what we can confidently guess is really, really important. The kind of things we know now that we weren't sure of a few months ago, pardon me, would be the consistency of our clients, the resiliency of our clients, how many are struggling, how many will struggle because of this, and how many will be able to stay the course and be sustainable and consistent in their business relationships. We've seen all of that in the past lockdown, so we have a level of understanding for where we are now that we didn't have before. We have a probable understanding of what a lockdown will do to our turnover, how we'll be able to handle a change in turnover, a change in profits, a change in costs. And we also have possibly learned and understand ways to pivot, ways that worked and ways that didn't work. So we should be able to plan a lot more predictably for the circumstances we're in right now. Now, just to clarify some things that we do have, the wage subsidy extension is there. Originally, there was no clarity about this at the time when the lockdown was announced, but now there is going to be a resurgence wage subsidy, which is a 2-week payment for employers who meet the criteria. So what we're looking at here is that we must be able to verify a 40% drop in revenue for a 14-day period that appears between the 12th of August and the 10th of September 2020. So the period has already commenced, and we need to be obviously looking at our numbers and getting ready with as much information as we can in order to prepare an application if we qualify for the resurgence wage subsidy. The conditions around that are that we must not already be receiving the wage subsidy or the wage subsidy extension, or leave support scheme payments. So if we are benefiting from an existing subsidy scheme or an existing financial support scheme, we are not entitled to participate in the resurgence wage subsidy. And obviously the condition is that employees who are being claimed for under the wage subsidy must be retained during the subsidy, and employers must try their hardest, that's the actual words, to pay 80% of normal wage or at least the wage subsidy. So those conditions, we understand they existed in the last subsidy as well. And obviously taking active steps to mitigate the financial impact of COVID-19. So they are looking, even in this short period of time that this resurgence subsidy would apply, they want to see that employers are doing their best to limit the impact of COVID-19, whether that's through pivoting strategies or other cost reduction measures. They want to see that you are taking some steps to deal with the financial impact. And the clarity that we need, businesses can apply for this resurgence wage subsidy from 1 p.m. on the 21st of August until the 3rd of September 2020. The leave support scheme has also been modified in order to assist employers. In this case, all restrictions and conditions have been removed. So previously you had a 30% decline in business as a requirement, or the ability to support an employee has been negatively affected because of the COVID-19 restrictions. Those conditions have been removed. In other words, any employee who is now absent from work on the basis of self-isolation or is ill because of COVID-19 can apply for a leave support scheme. And this is intended to remove the barriers to a person getting tested. Now, obviously, this is around the primacy of testing as a management strategy. They want to make sure that people are not choosing to not get tested because they don't want to have to go into self-isolation and lose out on earnings. And also to ensure that people self-isolate when asked by helping to cover the wages when unable to work. So generally, this process is designed to make it easier and more predictable that employees will actually agree with strategies to minimize transmission. Okay, now in recent times, I published an article around court decisions that give us some degree of clarity about strategies that companies adopted in the past. Sorry, there's a question here. When did the leave support scheme come into effect? It has already been in effect for quite some time. It is simply continuing without the conditions that used to exist. So if you apply for an employee now who has gone into isolation for any reason, you no longer have to prove the 30% reduction in income or that you are struggling to support that employee because of COVID-19. So simply they've removed the conditions. The leave scheme has been in place for some months now. So looking at these court decisions, there were two main ones that really had an impact because what happened in the first lockdown was a lot of companies moved really fast, and in some cases, they didn't have due regard for the employment law that hadn't been changed and was still very much valid while they made their decisions. Some of those decisions then got challenged and tested, and two of those have proven really relevant to the employment industry right now. So in the Dove Hospice case, they made a decision to cut everyone's pay to 80%, and they implemented it, but they didn't consult and obtain agreement from the employees, and they didn't obtain that agreement in writing, either through the minutes of a meeting or by signed letters to each individual employee. And what the court basically felt was that in the absence of consultation and agreement to vary the terms, Dove did not have a legal basis to reduce normal wages or salary due. Now, this doesn't mean that employees don't agree. It means the company doesn't have proof of agreement. So when there's a challenge to the authority, the company is not able to turn around and say, here are the signed letters, here are the minutes of the meeting indicating that there was 100% approval to implement this and nobody disagreed. So in the absence of that ability to prove, when there was a challenge, Dove was found to have not fulfilled employment law processes by not obtaining proper agreements to a change that it wanted to make. The other important thing was that there was a debate around Dove saying that because employees were unable to work, it meant that they were not willing to work. Now, the importance of that distinction is that when people are not willing to work, it brings into play the Wage Protection Act and excludes them from getting paid. But when they are unable to work, the Wage Protection Act stays in force and they are protected in terms of their right to be paid. So Dove tried to say people were not willing to work by the fact that they weren't at work, but that was not accepted and the Wage Protection Act was still valid. In the Gate Gourmet case, this is a more interesting one in the sense that pay was reduced, but was still above the old minimum wage. So at the time when they did the pay reduction, people were earning more than $17.70 an hour. But when the minimum wage was increased by law on the 1st of April, they were then earning below the new minimum wage of $18.90. Gate Gourmet was saying, well, because they weren't working, that didn't matter. We didn't have to do anything about the pay they were receiving because they weren't working and therefore not actually entitled to be paid. A similar argument as above. But the court said that that is not true, that even if they're not working, they are entitled to be paid above the minimum rate. So this kicks into the field. A very, very important aspect is that the Wage Protection Act and the minimum rate can never be contravened in this situation. The only possibility of doing that is by obtaining agreement to go to another percentage, but no matter what the percentage is, you cannot be taking people below the minimum rate. Okay, and the controversial part of this case was that all monies that were short paid had to be repaid. That was part of the court order. That is currently still the case, but obviously the company is appealing that because that's a huge financial hit, and they are arguing that that is not a fair outcome for them in that case. So here we have two cases that have clearly warned employers to comply with the employment law, that even in the case of rapidly changing alert levels, in the case of rapidly changing work environments, we are still required as employers to comply as much as possible with the employment law. And this is very relevant to us because going into this new lockdown phase, obviously we had to move fast, and we may still have to move fast to create strategies for the future. Complying with the existing employment laws, which have not been suspended, is incredibly important. I have a question here around the leave support payment. I want to come back to that because it's important. Can the leave support be applied to an employee that lives out of Auckland and restricted to cross the border to work? I would guess that this is going to be done, decided yes, it can be, because obviously the employee is in a similar position to anyone who's self-isolating. They're simply not allowed to enter Auckland in order to work. So the circumstances that apply to a self-isolating employee have been forced to apply to them. I don't know the answer to this for sure, but I'm fairly sure that it could be argued that they fall in exactly the same situation as a self-isolating employee and would therefore be entitled to leave support. Remember, the whole goal of this process is to help employees assist us to limit the spread. So if you have employees who are crossing the border or trying to cross the border because they don't want to lose income, that's going to endanger the whole limitation strategy. Okay, so paying employees during alert level 3, this is always a big question. So it's quite simple actually. Employees who can work from home should be paid full pay. Employees who cannot work from home but work full-time at the workplace should be paid full pay. Employees who are in a position where they can work a limited amount, so for example in a retail business, having less people in the store, having limited working hours, any number of factors that mean you can only work a certain portion of what you normally work, they should also be being paid full pay unless the employer negotiates and agrees in writing an alternative arrangement. Okay, now this is in the short-term period until the 26th of August. You might consider using annual leave by agreement. You might consider unpaid leave. There's a number of options you might be able to do because it's very short term. You could also require annual leave to be taken. The difficulty with this is that the law says that you must give 14 days notice as an employer if you want to require an employee to take annual leave. And obviously, there isn't 14 days notice possible in the short-term environment that we live in right now. There's a question here as well. Following the Dove case, what happens if the employees do not agree to lower their wages, even if it's necessary for the business to survive? Are you then obliged to still pay them at the previous full rate? Well, this is a tricky situation because effectively what you are doing, and I'll go into this in more detail, but I will answer it now. What you're doing is you're saying to the employees that the business is not sustainable at its current levels of expense. Part of making the business sustainable is a reduction in our payroll expense. And this is what we propose to do. If your employees turn around and say, we are not willing to assist you in this regard, we want to carry on getting our full pay, this brings into play the only other scenario that is possible, that you would then have to restructure and possibly make people redundant in order to reduce your expenses. So for an employee or a group of employees to refuse lower pay does create the possibility that the door opens to the employer to make employees redundant in order to reduce the wage pool. Now, the challenge here, and this is really important, is that if you do that as a threat, if you say, we are going to reduce your pay, and if you don't, I'll make you redundant, that is a threatening environment where an employee could say, well, you're not consulting in good faith. Okay, so if that threat is made one-on-one to an employee, I would say that there's a line being crossed. But if it's simply a fact of life, if it's an inevitable consequence of being unable to manage the business through consultation, where you are unable to make the cost savings you need, then going to the next legitimate stage of redundancy to say, well, if I can't manage my costs through consultation, I will have to manage them through a redundancy exercise. That's a legitimate process, and you're able to do that, as long as you don't make threats around that to individual employees. Okay, so the new alert level create the following challenges. There are very short time frames we've talked about. There's uncertainty. There's re-implementing of stricter workplace protocols, which can affect how much work you can do, how much throughput the business can have, how many people can be in the workplace at the same time, slowing down the work processes. This will result in reduced turnover of the business. It could affect supply chain challenges where, for example, you may be able to function, but your supplier can't. You may be able to function, but your client can't, and therefore they slow your business down in a knock-on effect. And obviously business end-to-end timeframes can take a major impact here. And I think, for example, logistics, transport in and out of Auckland. If businesses are importing goods into Auckland and then they have to be shipped out of Auckland, then there are obviously restraints around how quickly that's going to happen. And all of this has an impact on cash flow, it has an impact on business risk, and it has an impact on employment law risk. So what I want to take you through now for the rest of the presentation is what we can do as employers in the context of all of this, how we would handle the workplace change scenarios that are likely in front of us. Okay, so the foundations of employment relations are the employment contract, the relevant employment laws, and the court decisions that have been made. I've spoken to you about those two important court decisions. The employment laws that bind us are the Employment Relations Act, the Holidays Act, the Wage Protection Act, Parental Leave and Employment Protection Act, and the Health and Safety at Work Act. Now, primarily, the Holidays Act and the Wage Protection Act deal with the payment of employees and accrual of leave and things like that. The Employment Relations Act is the one that deals with the requirements to consult around restructuring and workplace change. And that's going to be the important thing that we look at for the next while. The employment contract, it must be stated, is the primary obligation between an employer and an employee. It is not lawful to make changes to an employee's working environment that contravene their written and signed employment contract. Okay, that is why consultation is so important, because the employment contract overrides everything in terms of the employment law, except that the employment law says that a contract can't reduce an employer's rights to below what the law says. But the moment your contract sets a standard that's higher than the law, then that employment contract is the binding relationship. So in terms of rates of pay, that's not contained in the law unless you go below the law. Amounts of annual leave, not contained in the law unless you go below the law. So the primary obligation of an employer is to comply with the employment contract. So the main uncertainties that employees are faced with is, will their pay be affected? For how long will their pay be affected? And could this possibly cost me my job through a redundancy exercise? If they don't know what their employer is thinking, they can't make their own plans. And in certain times, a lack of information limits an employee's choices to only, do I stay here or do I go? So we create a binary environment for the employee when they don't have enough information, where they literally are sitting there, do I look for another job or do I stay here and tough it out where I am? We want to create options for the employees so they feel confident to stay, knowing that the business has this issue in hand, okay? So it's the good faith consultation that will create buy-in and a willingness to partner an employee through these hard times. And the good faith consultation is really the foundation of complying with employment law when you are embarking on a workplace change process. And it's really, really important not to underestimate the power of an inclusive process. So workplace change is designed to deal with any changes to the working relationship that are governed by the employment contract. How to go about making these changes is governed by strict requirements, and that's what I'm going to take you through now. So if you were changing working hours, if you were changing the location of an employee's work, majorly, for example, requiring them to relocate their home, methods of work, new technology or processes that might be brought into a business that could reduce the number of employees that you would have in that business. If you're reducing pay for any reason or benefits for any reason, all of these things require a workplace change process. So the most important fundamental of workplace change requirements, and it is the key, It's the key principle governing all of employment law in New Zealand, is good faith. So good faith seems like a very, very vague term, but it has been clearly defined. And employment.gov.nz sets out this definition for everyone to know. Good faith means dealing with each other honestly, openly, and without misleading each other. It requires parties to be active and constructive in establishing and maintaining a productive relationship in which they are responsive and communicate. So this is a really, it's not a very good definition in law, but it's a very good definition if you think about it from the point of view of the feelings that it must create in the two parties. So if you feel that you're being dealt with honestly, if you feel that you're being dealt with openly and not being misled, then your employer is dealing with you in good faith. If you feel like your employer is being responsive and communicative with you, then your employer is complying with good faith processes. So the correct way to approach this definition as an employer is to put yourself in the position of the employee and imagine how the employee would feel in the context of the communication structures and processes that you have in place. And if you, putting yourself in the position of an employee, would potentially feel that things aren't as clear as they could be, that there are unknowns that don't need to be there, then the efforts to operate in good faith may need to be stepped up a bit. Okay, so there's the definition. That's the overarching thing that must be done. So really, it's going to come down to a commitment by an employer to operate in this way. And then you'll find that you'll be able to do things potentially even in a much shorter time frame than you would otherwise. Because if good faith is there, people don't mind if things have to be done fast, because they can trust the people doing what needs to be done. There's a book by Stephen M.R. Covey, who was the son of Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People person. And it's called The Speed of Trust. And it talks about a trust tax and a trust dividend. And if you have high trust, you will earn a trust dividend from your employees where they will give you the freedom to work fast and work perhaps without constraints because they trust you. Whereas you'll pay a trust tax if your employees do not trust you. They will demand to see and know more, and they will put rigorous controls around you to make sure that they're not being dealt with unfairly. So what level you're at in your trust relationship is going to be fundamental to your ability to implement workplace change fast and effectively in rapidly changing times. So one of the fundamentals of this whole process is the sharing of information. And one of the principles around doing this well is to do it in writing. Take the time to prepare a written proposal that contains useful and relevant information. So the kind of things you want to put in a written proposal would be why this is happening. Now, it might be obvious to everybody, but it's good to just put a few sentences down saying, this is what's happened to the business. This is why it's happened to the business. COVID-19 has done this and this and this, and therefore we find ourselves in this situation. Put some things in there about why your business is the way it is and how the way it is not sustainable. Put something in there about what you think is a good solution. And if you do this, then this will result and it will create some sustainability for you and when you'd like to do it. Okay. The other thing to do is to say, when I do this, it will have this impact on jobs, on pay rates, on people, on positions in the company. And this is how I have tried to minimize the impact. In other words, what people want to see in a written proposal is that you have done your homework to make it have as little an impact on people's jobs as possible. The other thing to put in that written proposal is a clearly outlined process going forward. And this turns into confidence. It turns into people being able to trust that you've thought about what you're doing, that you know what you're going to do, and they can say, okay, I need to knuckle down and hold the fort for a week, but in 1 week's time, we're going to look at this again. And just having that benchmark in place of when it might be reviewed or when the next decision is going to be made is a really strong indicator of good faith and trust. Okay, so I've talked a lot about genuine consultation, but there are some basic components to it which are really, really important. One is having enough time. So people must be given enough time to think about what you said, enough time to go and seek advice. They must be able to talk to each other. One of the really difficult things is to say this is really confidential and you can't even talk to each other about it. The ability to talk to each other is part of workplace consultation, so it wouldn't be good to take that away. They also need a way to submit ideas, whether it's in writing, by email, by text, however, or even verbally, but there must be a way to submit ideas and to have them recorded so that you are able to feed back to employees about what you've done with those ideas, how you've thought about them, how you've evaluated them, and why you have accepted or rejected them. They also need in the consultation process a guarantee that they will be listened to, that their ideas will be processed, considered, and reasonably dealt with. In other words, a proposal should not be rejected for an unknown reason. If someone says A and you decide not to do A, you should be able to say to that employee or to the whole employee group why you're not doing A. And then obviously the last point is exactly what I've said, and that's providing feedback to all employees about what you're doing, why you've decided to do what you're doing. And then the other important thing here is good communication as well. Okay, so what I recommend is face-to-face communication. I recommend that business owners front up, that you don't hide behind a screen, that you don't do things by email or through a surrogate, that you actually pull up that Zoom meeting and you sit there and you face employees head on. I have seen the most incredible examples of employers earning the trust of the employees by facing hard questions and taking it on the chin when they've either made a bad decision or when they are making hard decisions and their employees can see that it's affecting them by looking at their face and seeing that this is really hard. But when you hide behind a screen and you do it in a very non-present way, it is hard to trust a process. So I encourage you to do face-to-face meetings. I encourage you to be on that Zoom meeting and to be talking to people face-to-face. Definitely allow questions and answers. Let people get their hurts and their pains and their feelings out there and answer them and try and address them honestly and empathically so that people feel listened to and they feel supported. And obviously, as I've said repeatedly, your communication should be planned and should be well thought out so that people get a sense that you know where you're going. You may not know the eventual destination, but you've got a roadmap and you're following the roadmap. And this is going to be well handled in accordance with the roadmap. So that's really important. Okay, so here we go through everything. I've spoken about preparing the written proposal, but what I want you to think about now is in a time period where there is rapid change, where, for example, we're here on Wednesday the 19th, but on Wednesday the 26th, things could change radically. You can't just prepare one scenario for that situation. You can't just prepare that you're going to be in level 2 or level 3 and not think what's going to happen next week on Wednesday. So what I recommend you do is have a couple of scenarios and talk about all of them. So imagine you have to structure the business to survive until the 26th, but you also need to structure the business after the 26th if things get better or things get worse. It would be good to have both those proposals available and say to the employees, listen, we know what to do this week, but we don't know what to do after the 26th. But if things get worse, here's what we're going to propose. If things get better, here's what we're going to propose. We'd like your thoughts about all of these things so that we can decide now what we're going to do, and you can have predictability, that you know in a week's time what we will do in option A and option B. You know what we've decided, we've already talked about it. That speeds up your decision making on the 26th. So in that fixed point in future where you know something's going to need to be decided on, you've already done the fundamentals and put them in place to make that decision quickly. You have time now. You may not have time to make your decisions for this week, but you are blessed with 1 week's grace to understand and plan for what's going to happen on the 26th. So my advice is to do that consultation now and get it done quickly, so that when the 26th rolls around, you're not left doing another phase of consultation. You've already done it by planning ahead. The thing to do is to do all of this via a meeting. Obviously, some meetings will be via Zoom. Some can still be in person, depending where in the country you are. But I would definitely record who's at that meeting. You could even call the meeting fairly urgently. So if you wanted to do a meeting this afternoon, and you call the meeting now, you certainly could do that. The situation permits that kind of urgency. But once you have the meeting, you need to then provide enough time for people to work through what you're talking about in the meeting. So in the meeting, I would say lay out the scenarios, ask for input, stress the unknowns and the challenges. People need to be able to partner you in working through the unknowns. Some of them may have really good ideas, and this is part of the joy of consultation, is you can actually learn just how much people know about your business that can help you run your business better. There are very many situations where literally people who are not decision makers in the workplace have intimate and really important knowledge about how things could be done better and how things could work for the good of the business, and allowing people the opportunity to mention those things can really inform your decision making. Be okay with not having definitive answers at the moment. No one does, but have a plan and be confident and clear in the process. Then set a deadline for input to be received. So in other words, when you have this consultation, say, I would like all input, whether it's submitted by email, by text, by phone call, whatever, to be submitted by 4 p.m. on this date, so that everyone knows that they must do their homework, get their information to you by this date. It gives you the confidence that people who are taking you seriously will do their work on time, and you'll be able to then, from that deadline, be able to work with the information you've got and process it and start to make decisions. If you don't have this deadline, you are in a position where people might have something really important to say, but aren't motivated or encouraged to get it to you in a time frame that works for the whole process. The other thing here is, although you set a deadline, it's not a hard stop. Somebody who submits something useful an hour later or a day later should still, where possible, be considered, because that is good faith, to not shut somebody down just because they missed the deadline. So although you have the deadline in place, be prepared to work around it if necessary. Okay, once you get all that information, your job is then to collate it all to make sure you have taken every one of those issues into account and prepared an answer as to why you think it's irrelevant or not helpful or expensive or impractical or good, and you might use it. But every one of those proposals deserves the honor of a considered response, so that the employee and all the other employees watching and listening feel that you've taken them seriously. One of the key things which I haven't mentioned so far in this process is that whatever you do is being seen by everybody, and your motives and your integrity are being judged by everybody, even those who are not affected by what you're doing. So please be careful to realize that we are all in a public space, and doing this process really needs us to be thinking about how everybody is viewing what we do. Okay, so once you've considered everything, you're now going to be responsible for feeding it all back to the employee. So you have that second meeting. And I would say you set out the date for that second meeting in your first meeting. So everyone knows in 7 days' time at 4 p.m. or 3 p.m., we're going to have another Zoom meeting, and we're going to hear about all these proposals and whether any of them were valuable to the business and what they've decided to do. So you would then do that. You'd go through the proposals. You'd talk about why they were, accepted or rejected, and take questions about that if necessary. This is the important thing about being face-to-face with your team. And then after that, you're in a position where you've made your decision based on everything you've received, and you now have to implement it. And that comes down to if somebody's position is redundant and they're going to be laid off, you have a one-on-one meeting with them, and you talk to them one-on-one about the negative impact of this decision. If that's not happening and you simply are going to implement what you've already spoken about in your meeting, I would write a letter to each individual employee asking them to sign and return acceptance of what's been agreed. And I would then do that. Okay, and that's how you would go about doing this process. So the key thing I want to highlight for you here is plan for the future situations. Don't just make a one-off decision for this week without thinking about the fact that on the 26th, there will be a fork in the road and you will have to go down a slightly different path. Or you might go down exactly the same path, but that scenario must be planned for now while you have time to do that. And then if the decision can be made now as to what will happen in scenario A, B, or C on the 26th, then at least you've done that work, and the employees will know when the 26th announcement comes. They will know, Jacinda said this, therefore we're going to do that. And there's no need for any rushed decision making. All right, so folks, that is everything I wanted to say to you about how to prepare for this process in the meantime. I appreciate that there's a lot of rush, that there's a lot of stress around some of these issues. Some of you are lucky, you're in a position where you already know what's going to happen to your business, and you've done everything you need to do. Others of you are sitting where you've got to start this process, or you have to see the process through and maybe think about a far more complex scenario for your business. Depending on the industry you're in, you might have very different scenarios to other people sitting in this webinar. So my encouragement to you is plan and prepare early for the changes that are coming. Be thorough, be clear, and communicate your heart out so that everybody has a real sense that you are invested in the good faith aspect of this process. Let me go through some questions now. If you would like, I will. You can start putting some questions through on the question and answer page, and I'll have a look at those. So there's a question here: what is a reasonable time frame to have a restructure process from start to finish in these times? This is a really important question, because a lot of people feel that going quickly through a process means it's unfair. That's not the case. It comes down to the level of trust that you have with your employees and the degree to which you comply with the good faith requirements. In a normal work environment, you could have a consultation phase that lasts 5 days. In a high pressure time like this, you can have a consultation phase that lasts 2 days. The important thing is is to do it in good faith and to make sure that people are aware of the reduced time frame, that they are aware of why it's reduced, that they're aware of the urgency around the process, and that you've got them on board in terms of, yes, we'll do this in this short time frame. So you can definitely shift your timeframes around consultation as needed by the timeframes that you have. But it's really important that you explain why those timeframes are short and give employees a sense of the urgency around doing it, and that should be fine. Consultation is the big one. It's the one that normally takes the longest. So if you reduce that, that's the one that I would have the most care in explaining why it's being reduced. But you can certainly conduct an entire restructuring process or a workplace change process. Let me not say restructuring. You can conduct a workplace change process in a week, possibly even less, if you are really careful to follow the processes right and you are a high trust workplace. If you are a low trust workplace, this could be a problem in the sense that people will see the shortened time frame as trying to railroad a decision through. So the other part of a shorter time frame is the clarity that you communicate that you haven't made decisions yet, that you're relying on the consultation phase and the feedback to obtain information to make a final decision. If it ever looks like you've already made a decision, you've lost the good faith aspect of the consultation anyway. So in all of your communications, in anything that you're doing, the really important thing is to not come across like you've already made a decision. Bring employees on board in the process before you make a decision, and that helps the good faith to be there. So even if you do it over a much shorter time frame, act in good faith and you should be fine. Another question here, how can we manage daily Zoom catch-ups if employees think we are micromanaging them by checking up on them every day? What are some of the tips you can recommend to communicate our intentions with those meetings? Well, again, the high trust environment is really important, but it's a bit late to build that if it isn't already built. So without commenting critically on this question and saying that this workplace environment must be a low trust environment, because it certainly isn't necessarily like that. Employees feel differently about different processes. How the daily catch-up happens is a big factor. So if it's part social, part fun, part jovial, part touching base, and some work as well, then it has a much more social feel to it than if it's purely, are you doing this, are you doing that, have you met this requirement? So micromanaging is really a function of how you communicate the meeting, how you set it up, what your agenda is, how rigidly you're running it. These will all be factors that go into whether people are feeling micromanaged or feeling connected with. And I would encourage you all, if you're doing daily Zoom catch-ups, which is fairly frequent, it's fairly often, make sure it's more social than work-related, because in the course of a week, you'll get to all the work issues, even in 5 social catch-ups. But if you're going to do 1 or 2 a week, then it can be a little bit more focused around the work, because it won't be as regular and people won't feel as closely watched. I hope that helps. It's a difficult one to answer, but I do hope that that does help. If you don't need to do daily Zoom catch-ups, don't do daily Zoom catch-ups. That can be a little much if it's clear that you are looking over their shoulders by doing so. Rather do 2 or 3 times a week or once a week if that's all you really, really need. And leave people to deliver results on their own terms. To follow up on that as well, if you find that people aren't delivering, deal with them about it. Talk to them. Be very clear about what your expectations are and the fact that they're not measuring up to what you expect from them. But do it in a kind way, in a constructive way. And make notes of it so that if it becomes a long-term issue, you can actually deal with it. Here's an important question. If they're getting full pay but not working, do we have to accrue the leave as well? Okay, this question has come up a few times and it is really important. Employment is continuous in almost all circumstances. So one of the situations where it is continuous is when you're on ACC leave, for example, when you're on parental leave. So in other words, there are situations where people are not at work, where it's very clear that the law expects their employment to be regarded as continuous. And when your employment is continuous, you continue to accrue annual leave and sick leave and all those benefits that apply to your length of service. So the law says that in every year of employment, an employee is entitled to a minimum of 4 weeks annual leave and 5 days sick leave. So because they are continuously employed across this COVID period, they are still accruing that leave. What might change is how they are paid at the end of the day, but it's too early to comment on that because the changes are too small at the moment. But for example, annual leave is always paid at the greater of an ordinary weekly pay or the average weekly pay for the past 52 weeks. Now, when people are on different pay rates for a long period of time, this can have an impact on how much they're actually paid. But the fact that they're accruing the annual leave and the sick leave, that does not change. Okay. So this question is, sorry, there's a question here which actually duplicates that. So when people are employed but on any kind of COVID arrangement, they are still accruing annual leave. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm reading through some questions here. I apologize. Give me a second, please. Okay, so if someone has been able to pay staff 100% for everyone in the organization from March until now, or even if it was 80%, how do they best approach the staff if they don't qualify for the resurgence subsidy and the staff are not able to work during lockdown? Or you're only able to pay a small amount, for example, 20%. Okay, so 20% is a really small amount of pay. And what you might be in a position there is that employees might not be able to survive on 20% of pay. So what you're looking at here is quite a big impact on the workplace and on the employees. I think that when you're in this level of difficulty, you should be conducting a restructuring exercise. You should be thinking about a new look and feel for the business, a new size, a new structure for the business that will enable it to survive the lockdown phase. So definitely going to employees and saying, can we pay you 20%? You're probably going to find a lot of employees will say, absolutely not. I can't pay my mortgage. I can't pay my debts. I can't pay my school fees. I can't put food on the table. These are all serious issues. So you may find that offering 20% without the resurgence subsidies and things is not sustainable for your employees. In this situation, I would be only getting to that position with a really detailed consultation process where people are being really clearly told about what's going on, because clearly in this kind of situation, the business seems to be in substantial difficulty. And what I would want to do then is look at restructuring the business into a mode that would enable it to survive and make it through till the end of the year. And then hopefully at some point when all of this sorts itself out, the business will still exist and can potentially rehire people if you've had to make them redundant. But certainly you would not be able to continue paying people at 100%. So you would start a workplace change exercise where you would lay out the different scenarios and why you're in the position you're in, what proposals could see the business survive, and get their input on how to go about that. All right. The question, are we able to get a copy of this webinar? Yes, it has been recorded, and anyone who's attended it will be emailed a link where they can access the recording. So that should enable you to do that. In any event as well, most of you are either clients of HR Assured or are interested in looking at it as a possible option. One of the avenues that you have with HR Assured is to have access to telephonic advice where you can be guided through a process like this as well. So if you are interested in more than a copy of the webinar, please feel free to contact us through our website about that. All right, folks, that's everything I have for you. There are no more questions that have come up that I can add value to you by answering. So I certainly hope this has been a productive and a helpful webinar to you. Please consider carefully the thoroughness of your communication and just taking the time to make sure you plan well and that you set up for yourselves a success by looking carefully at the options going forward and preparing in advance for them. I look forward to our next webinar. I hope to see you all there, and I hope that there can be good stories of how well you've handled this process. I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.